Welcome back to Co-op Radio 102.7 FM CFRO. This is Monday Brown Bagger. I have as a guest Annie Machon. Annie, you were talking during the break there. You wanted to talk about your stuff that you went through in MI5, why you left MI5, and also you were mentioning F2.
Well, actually, it was really because we started off the conversation looking at 9/11, why I think we need new inquiry. I used to work as an intelligence officer in MI5, and with my ex-partner David Shaler, we ended up blowing the whistle and having to go on the run and go through court cases and everything, because we exposed a case of what's become known as false flag terrorism. And in this case, an attack goes ahead, it's a terrorist attack, and it's blamed on one party but carried out by another, often an intelligence agency. And in this specific issue, we saw Colonel Gaddafi of Libya being attacked by a cell of Islamic extremist terrorists who had been funded by MI6, which is our sort of external security service, the sort of James Bond wing of intelligence. And the attack went wrong. The attack was illegal under UK law as well, and innocent people died. So I can't think really of anything much more heinous than that as a crime. And really, I just wanted to flag up the idea that false flag terrorism is a reality. You know, we had to go on the run for exposing it, and David went to prison twice because of that. And there are many, many other instances throughout the last few decades of such attacks. So I think it's always worth people bearing in the back of their minds that the fact that these sort of things do occur. And when they look at new atrocities that happen, like 9/11 or 7/7 or whatever, just to intelligently approach the subject and say, well, you know, what's really going on here? Do we just have to believe the headlines in the mainstream media?
You were also mentioning, I ran across something on the internet that you mentioned something about the attack on the Israeli embassy in London, that could possibly be a false example of a false flag operation.
Yeah, another one, in fact. This was a car bomb that was planted outside the Israeli embassy in 1994 in London. And in this case, the senior MI5 officer who was in charge of the investigation, so he'd seen all the evidence and all the intelligence, assessed that Mossad had carried out the attack themselves. Now, of course, if you read that on the internet, you think it was some sort of mad conspiracy theory, but as I said, this was the formal assessment by a guy whose code number was G91. And he reasoned that Mossad had done this for two reasons. First of all, to increase security by letting off what was effectively a very controlled explosion outside the embassy. They're always hassling MI5 for greater protection because there are a lot of Arab dissidents and rebels based in London. And of course, by doing this, they got that increased protection. But also, they managed to plant the blame on two Palestinian students who were living in London at the time, a young woman called Sama Alami and a young man called Jawed Botmeh. And they were arrested and charged and convicted of conspiring to cause that attack and were sentenced to 20 years each for that. Again, this is sort of a classic case, apparently, of false flag terrorism, according to G91, where a Palestinian organisation is blamed for it, but is carried out by the Israeli intelligence organisation Mossad. And by blaming this Palestinians, it shattered a Palestinian support network, which was gaining traction in London at the time. They were gaining sort of political momentum. They were raising funds for people stuck in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it's interesting. It's interesting. This stuff does go on. It's perfectly standard methodology used by spy agencies. So as I said, you know, every time something big occurs, it's always worth bearing that in the back of our minds and thinking intelligently about the evidence around an atrocity. I'm not saying, you know, real terrorism doesn't occur. Of course it does. But we have to be informed and intelligent about how we approach that issue.
One question I have to ask you is about Princess Diana. Her death, basically what your information of what your former partner and yourself were going through is going to be released over in London. However, Princess Diana's death happened, and that filled the newspapers. What is your thoughts on that, Princess Diana's death? Could it be an accident, or could it be more than what people are now talking about?
Well, that was interesting timing because, yes, we blew the whistle in August 1997. In fact, it was the weekend before Diana died. So the newspapers in the UK, I mean, this was a huge story at the time. It's a long time ago now, but it was headline stories for a week. The government, of course, took out an injunction against the media and against Shaler to stop any further disclosures the following weekend, which was interesting because that got the whole of the UK media on our side. They were saying, we're the free press, you can't injunct us, you can't gag us, we've got a duty to report the facts. Yeah. Anyway, so it was looking pretty good. You know, we had the support of the media behind us, and we hoped that they would start pressing for an inquiry into some of the crimes we were reporting on the part of the spies. And on the Saturday night, we went to bed, thinking, you know, great, we've got a bit of support, and woke up the next morning to find Princess Diana had died in Paris that night. So, of course, that did dominate the newspapers for weeks afterwards, and we were lost in Europe, two whistleblowers with no sort of no support from the media. I don't know what went on there, but I would say that there were some interesting developments after this, because about 2 months after her death, we were contacted by Mohammed Al-Fayed, the father of Dodi Al-Fayed, her partner, and he wanted us to go up to Paris and look at some documents that he had been offered by a man called Oswald Lewinter. Now, these documents appeared to be telexes sent between the CIA and MI6, which appeared to indicate that they had some involvement in trying to murder Diana. Now, Oswald Lewinter was a notorious asset of the CIA and also MI6. So it was an interesting case, perhaps, of a straw man technique, where he would sell Mohammed Al-Fayed these documents, which apparently proved the murder of his son and Princess Diana. Mohammed Al-Fayed would make a huge fuss about this in the media, and then the documents were forgeries. So, of course, then the experts could turn around and say, oh, yeah, but there's these little errors. You know, they're obviously not real. So Mohammed Al-Fayed would have lost any credibility. Nobody would have believed any other evidence he would have brought forward. That's a classic straw man technique. By asking us to have a look at the documents, both David Shell and myself, we could see that they were forgeries because of these minor mistakes. They were good forgeries, but they were forgeries. So he didn't buy them. I mean, Oswald Lewinter was offering these documents for $20 million as well. So I'm not saying, you know, she was murdered, but what I would say is that there was certainly, apparently, some sort of intelligence involvement in this. Now, the other factor as well was that Henri Paul, the driver of the car that crashed that night, had some interesting history as well, because it turned out he had multiple bank accounts held in different banks in France, into which he regularly paid large amounts of cash. Now, he always paid just under £5,000 worth of money into these accounts, francs in those days. And that was quite a canny move, because if you put more than £5,000 worth of money into a bank account in France, it triggers an investigation, possible money laundering for terrorism or whatever. If it's just under, then nobody notices it. And he did this repeatedly. And this would be a classic pattern for an informer, for an agent working for certain intelligence agencies. Again, they would warn him not to put too much money in each account. And of course, he was the head of security at the Ritz. He would be a key prime person for many, many intelligence agencies to get on side as an asset, because then, you know, many important and influential people of interest to various intelligence agencies would stay at the Ritz in Paris. And if they had Henri Paul on their books, then he could let them into the rooms, they could bug rooms or whatever, check records. So he, of course, probably was working as an asset for possibly the CIA or MI6 or the French intelligence agencies, whoever.
Also with Dr. David Kelly. Mm-hmm. He's one of the people that he allegedly committed suicide. He was saying that a lot of the information that was used for the run-up to the Iraqi war was not truthful. And all of a sudden, this gentleman ends up dead in the forest somewhere. What is my thoughts are, and I seriously question whether or not he might have been taken out possibly by someone involved within the British government. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a weight of evidence to say that he couldn't have committed suicide in the way he was supposed to have. I mean, it's a very messy case. Many eminent doctors have come forward in the UK and said you can't commit suicide in the way that the press reported he had. Also, we have an MP called Norman Baker, who's a bit of a crusading MP, who has done a lot of research into this issue, and he is convinced that Kelly was murdered. By whom is another matter. We've never had a proper coroner's inquest into his death, into this man's death, even though he was at the eye of the hurricane at that time, because of his disclosures that the intelligence that took the UK into war was sexed up. I mean, he was the whistleblower that did that, that said that. So I just don't know. I mean, it sounds like he probably was murdered in the woods. We don't know by whom. We've had no proper inquiry into this. We did have an inquiry, but that tended to focus more on an argument that broke out between the reporter, Andrew Gilligan, who worked for the BBC, and Tony Blair's spin doctors. It didn't address the issue, the tragic death of a man who had bravely blown the whistle on, false intelligence.